go inside the house. I walk around to the front. Give you a little bit more to go by. See? Walk around the front. Make it around there.
State historic site. My name is Stephanie. I'm a park ranger here. Before we get started going inside, I want to talk a little about how it became a state park. Anybody here happen to know who used to own Rose Hill Plantation way back in the 1800s? His name was William Henry Gist, and William Henry Gist was a governor of South Carolina. He was governor from 1858 to 1860, and William Henry Gist is known as the secession governor, as he's the governor who laid a lot of the foundations for South Carolina to secede, break away from the United States. He has the nickname of the secession governor as a result of that. As for William Henry Gist, Rose Hill was his main homestead. He inherited some of the property from it from his father, Francis. Francis Gist, William Henry's father, came here in 1811 from Charleston. Francis was a merchant. He was trying to become a wealthy plantation owner, part of the elite, and he purchased some land here and set up to be, hopefully, in his opinion, a plantation owner. And then he died 8 years later. Most of his property, which was land, furniture, artwork, and enslaved individuals, went to his only child, William Henry Gist. William Henry Gist, at the age of 12, inherited about 1,000 plus acres of land, furniture, artwork, and 23 enslaved individuals. He was taken care of, William Henry Gist, by his uncle until he reached the age of maturity, and then he took over the plantation and expanded Rose Hill to be about a 2,000-acre cotton plantation. He lived here much of his life, along with his family, and at any given point in time, up to 178 people were enslaved by Gist and forced to live and labor here. Following emancipation, the end of the Civil War, and the ratification of the 13th Amendment, this plantation, like many other plantations, switched over to a tenant farming sharecropping system of labor. Many of the tenant farmers were formerly enslaved individuals who had newly gained freedom, and they formed labor contracts with William Henry Gist and later his descendants to farm the land. In exchange for this labor, they received sometimes a little bit of money, sometimes a share of the crop, sometimes room and board, a lot of times a combination of multiple things. And tenant farmers lived on the property of Rose Hill in tenant houses, and later on, when the White Gist family stopped living in the mansion, they started renting it out, and many of the renters were tenant farmers. The renting on went on into the 1900s, and then in 1939, the Gist family, who owned the 2,000 acres, sold it to the United States Forest Service. The Forest Service had been going around at the time and buying lots of old plantation land. Rose Hill was just a little bit of the thousands and thousands of acres that the Forest Service had acquired. And with all this land, they started to plant trees. They planted so many trees, they literally created a forest. Sumter National Forest, which you drove through today to get here, and which surrounds the state park. But the Forest Service, we think, may not have been very interested in some of the buildings that they acquired. The mansion here was getting pretty run down, and it was getting even more run down without renters in it. The Daughters of the American Revolution in the area, the DAR, were concerned about the status of the secession governor's old home, and they started to look for a sponsor to save it. They found this man, Clyde Franks, from nearby Lawrence County. Clyde Franks, very into preservation work, agreed to take on the project of Rose Hill if the DAR could get the land. The DAR bartered with the U.S. Forest Service and managed to acquire 44 acres of what used to be about 2,000. They gave those 44 acres to Clyde Franks to work on, and he worked on the house here and surrounding landscape from about 1943 to 1960. And in 1960, 44 acres was sold to the state of South Carolina, and it's been a state park since then. So just a brief history on how we actually got here and became a state park. When we head inside, it is a museum, so the basics, please don't touch, sit, lean on anything. No food or drink. You are welcome to take pictures, but if you do so, please keep the flash off. Any questions before we head in?
I'm good.
Okay, let's head in.
Let's go in. Now go ahead.
As we enter the hallway, you'll see right here, we do have a copy of the Ordinance of Secession. Gist was known as the secession governor, And this is a good copy. You'll notice there are many signatures on it. There are 170 signatures. All of the signatories were very prominent, wealthy, white, elite men of South Carolina who signed the Ordinance of Secession, declaring they were signing on behalf of all South Carolina citizens. South Carolina was the first state to secede. They did so December 20th, 1860, and seceded to preserve the institution of slavery in the South. Feel free to take a look, and then we're going to head right in the dining room. So this room may have been used as a dining room for the Whitegis family to eat their meals. Unfortunately, we don't have any records to tell us what was ever eaten here, but we do have a record, a journal entry from a visitor in 1859. This man mentions in his journal that one evening when he was dining here, he was served robin, the bird robin. So we know they ate robins. We don't know much else, but we can make some really good guesses. Rose Hill, as I mentioned, was a cotton plantation. That was the cash crop that made William Henry Gist so wealthy, but they also grew a lot of corn. Well, some of that corn would have been sold. A lot of it would have been used right on site. Ground up into cornmeal, made into things like grits, cornbread, maybe distilled into whiskey. So a lot of corn-based products in their diet. Also a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables grown seasonally, and a lot of game meat, things hunted for, venison, turkey, rabbit. Hogs were also very big in the upstate. They still exist in the upstate, but many people did have hogs on their land. And we know at times Gist had over 200 hogs. So it's very likely that pork was a primary meat in their diet. And Gist himself was pretty wealthy for this area, so he could afford things like sugar, which could be very expensive, and spices to add flavor to his meals. The enslaved individuals who made the food, cooked the food, raised the food, their meals would have been very different from that of the Whitegis family. They would have had far less food and just less variety. No sugar or spices in their diet likely. Unfortunately, we have no records to tell us what the enslaved people here at Rose Hill were given as an allotment of food. But because corn was such a primary staple, it's very possible their diet consisted of mostly cornmeal. Maybe they were given 2 or 3 gallons of cornmeal a week per person and a few fresh fruits and vegetables, and that may have been it for their entire weekly rations. But at this point, I want to give you guys some time to look around. You can ask me any questions about anything I've talked about, anything you see of interest. And then when you're ready, we'll head back out of the hallway. But take your time. We are going to head upstairs next, and then we'll head back down and see the rest of the first floor. As we head up, please keep to the railing on the wall only and take your time.
That boy. Circle staircase. Pretty neat. White pine. Look at white pine. That board there goes all the way to the end over there. That's pretty flooring they done.
So this room here, possible it was used as William Henry Gist's bedroom.
Bathtub.
We believe the bed and possibly the armoire, the wardrobe, is original. Now keep in mind, you had the Whitegis family here for many, many years, and then there were renters here for about 4 decades. So every room in the house likely had multiple purposes at different points with people occupying it. And you may have noticed, especially when we're downstairs, you do have electricity in this house. That was not added until the Park Service took over in 1960. Plumbing has never been added. No running water in this house. We don't know where the facilities were kept or what they look like, but we do have some examples in this room. But they are just examples, not original. But again, take your time here, and then we'll head into the attached room and talk more in there.
Built our house out.
The dress is original. It belonged to Mary Elizabeth, his second wife. 16 or 17 inch waist with a torso.
Here you go.
When you're ready, we'll head in here. We don't know what this room was used for, but it's possible it was used as a nursery for the Whitekist children. We've set it up as such, but again, we're not sure what its purpose was. And I'm going to open the door to get a little light in here, so you can see everything better. As for children, William Henry Gist, between 2 wives, had 14 children. Back then, people tend to have a lot of children. Some of that was the lack of birth control. And if you weren't wealthy like the Gist family and you owned a farm, then you wanted a lot of children to work on your farm. But the reason also behind it was children often didn't live to adulthood. Of those 14 children, only 5 survived to adulthood. No vaccines back then or antibiotics, and at times very limited and sometimes even no prenatal care. So many children did succumb to many diseases and various things. Of the 5 children of Gist that lived to adulthood, only 3 of them outlived their father. I'll point out in here, we do have an original portrait. It is of Ellen Douglas Gist. Ellen died a few months before she turned 6. And the portrait itself, it's possible it was painted after Ellen's death. As for those 3 children I mentioned who did outlive their father, one of them, her name was Maria. She was a daughter from the first marriage. When Maria was born in 1830, her mother died 11 days after giving birth to her. But Maria lived, and she lived to be 70 years old, which back then, 70 was a pretty decent lifespan. And she had 2 half-brothers, Richard and David, who also both lived to be about 70. Now, Richard and David were likely pretty well known in this general Union County area, as both were the surviving sons of the secession governor, and both were active members in the Ku Klux Klan. Following the end of the Civil War was the Reconstruction era, a time with a lot of change, a lot of progress, but also a lot of violence. African Americans were exercising their new rights and freedoms with the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment coming out in just a 5-year span. And Union County happened to have a very well-organized and politically active African American community that pretty quickly elected into office several African American men like Junius Mobley and others who represented them in the State House as constables, a variety of people. But there also was a lot of Klan violence. David Christopher Gist and his brother Richard Valerius Gist likely committed many heinous acts of violence, intimidation, and murder. We'll never know all the crimes they committed. A lot of times Klan activity wasn't recorded. It was just known by the general public during the time who did what. But David Christopher did have to flee to Texas for a few years to escape it was an indictment, but when he came back, nothing came of it. Neither man was ever convicted or done anything else or given any other punishment for their crimes. And both men likely committed many crimes, as I mentioned, including both of them were quite possibly part of the 1871 jail raid lynching. In early 1871, one night in January and one night in February, Klan members from not just Union County, but potentially many counties among the upstate, came to the Union County jail and kidnapped 12 African American men. They took those men to different areas in Union County where they were murdered. Many of those men were militiamen. There is one man that we haven't been able to count for, so it may have been 11 murders, and the other man was missing, but it may have been 12. Regardless, it was a heinous crime, with many people murdered, and it basically ended the progress of Reconstruction 6 years early in Union County compared to many other areas. That jail raid lynching did help in some ways spur the Ku Klux Klan trials, though, that happened in late 1871 in Columbia, where several Klan members and others were prosecuted for their crimes, but those that were prosecuted and convicted received generally a few years, and they weren't prosecuted for murder. They were generally prosecuted for violations of the 14th Amendment. So this is all part of Rose Hill's history. You're seeing a very pretty house. You're going to see a very pretty outside when we step on the balcony. But there's a very dark history here that you can't see, but is very much a part of it. And the truth of this plantation, and really all plantations and the nation itself. So take your time in here, and then when you're ready, we'll head out on the balcony. And again, any questions you have, please feel free to ask.
See the ground, good. Come up here. That's the history, people. I can't say nothing about that. That's the history.
And into the 1900s, when this was a working plantation, the landscape would have looked very different from what you're seeing today. There would have been some trees back then, some fruit nut trees, but nowhere near the amount you're seeing. A lot of the area would be open land. Some of that land filled with fields of cotton, corn, wheat, oats, and other things. And if you see movies of the old antebellum South, oftentimes when you think of plantations, you think cotton everywhere. But Hollywood didn't get that quite right. Cotton itself really depletes the nutrients from the ground, makes the soil very eroded and degrading, and they weren't quite understanding crop rotation in the 1800s yet. They were seeing the effects of cotton on the soil. It was making it very depleted, it was causing erosion and gullies to form, but they just didn't know necessarily what to do about it. So they plant cotton over and over in the same place, and after 6-7 years of cotton in the same place, that soil was so lacking in nutrients, it was useless, basically. They had to leave it to the wild, foul it to the wild for 2 to 3 decades, letting hogs, cattle, other animals roam across it, trying to nourish that very depleted land. But even after that period passed, the soil was nowhere near back to nutrient rich. So a lot of land up on cotton plantations in South Carolina was left to the wild, try to nourish it, or it was new land waiting for cotton when cotton depleted the land it was currently on. In the area of the upstate Rose Hill sits in, Satin, only 29% of a plantation's cultivated land would be used for cotton at once because of this. And then, of course, you'd have buildings. This was a big plantation, about 2,000 acres, with many people on it, and it was a very active, self-sufficient place, likely. So you would have the house we're touring today, and the brick building across the way. These are the only 2 original buildings of the plantation period here. But there would have been many more buildings back then, from a loom house, a cold storage, a blacksmith, and up to 178 people enslaved here at one time, multiple slave cabins. Unfortunately, all those other buildings have been lost to time. We know that they were here somewhere, we just don't know where or what they look like. All the other buildings you're seeing were built by Clyde Franks or the Park Service, or they were moved here by Clyde Franks. They may be historic buildings taken from another location and just plopped here. But they weren't here from the active plantation period from about 1811 all the way to 1939. But take your time out here, it is a beautiful day.
Yeah, it is. Can't say there.
So, we don't know what this room was used for, but it's possible it was used as a ballroom or entertainment room of sorts. There's also a rumor that this room used to house a removable wall or very sturdy partition. Now, nobody in the Park Service has ever seen this wall. But if it existed, it quite possibly went up right over here and may have divided this room into, say, bedrooms. Then you can always break down the wall, remove the furniture, have the open space, and reset when needed. But feel free to look around.
Check the old piano out. I can't play it, can't touch. Pretty chandeliers.
There is a third floor and attic of sorts. We're not going to be heading up there. The attic itself is just a room above the room we were just in. Then there's a hallway and another short hallway that accounts for the stairs, and then it's open space. We don't know what the attic was used for. Perhaps it was living quarters for enslaved individuals. Maybe it was guest quarters. Perhaps it was an area for a tutor for the white-faced children to live a few months out of the year and tutor them up there. Perhaps it was storage. We're just not sure. We just don't have the record to tell us. But currently we use it for primarily storage, and during most of the year, it is ridiculously hot up there, even with heat and air conditioning in this house. So take your time as you come down. Remember to keep to the railing on the wall and take your time. Fancy living room with a time period. Above the mantel, we do have portraits of William Henry Gist, and next to him his second wife, Mary Elizabeth. This room likely had many conversations take place in it. Talks about music and secession of the time, to slavery, Civil War, to talks about the Ku Klux Klan when his sons were here, to tenant farmers talking about friends and family members who were threatened or even murdered by Ku Klux Klan activity. So a lot of talks, many of it when Gist was here, political, as William Henry Gist was in politics for 20 years, from 1840 all the way through his end of term as governor in 1860. He may have made decisions here that affected the people of South Carolina and even people nationally. One thing we think Gist talked about potentially a lot in late 1859, about a year and a half before the Civil War started, was a man named John Brown. Anybody familiar with John Brown? I'm going to give you a brief overview. So John Brown was an abolitionist. Abolitionists were people who were against slavery. John Brown wanted to try to end slavery through a huge slave uprising. This uprising would start in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which is in West Virginia now, back then Virginia, and make its way down south, killing enslavers as they went. And he hoped enslaved people would self-liberate themselves, join the uprising, and get bigger and bigger and bigger until slavery just had to end in the United States. Now, prior to getting this slave uprising going, John Brown felt he needed more weapons. So he raided a federal armory in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. And that's where everything kind of went wrong for John Brown. The armory was surrounded by federal troops. Many in John Brown's small raiding party were killed. John Brown himself was captured and later executed for the raid at the armory and the conspiracy to commit a slave uprising. This made national news, even international news. Gist heard about it, and he would have been enraged that John Brown had the nerve, the audacity, to try to go through with the slave uprising. Now, Gist would have been very happy Brown had been stopped, captured, and executed. But Gist likely would have been a little scared as well, as John Brown got very close to that uprising getting going, and Gist was the kind of person, an enslaver, that John Brown had wanted to kill. Now, Gist would have maybe talked about this in the formal parlor for many months. Many formal parlors would talk about this, and a few months after the raid at Harper's Ferry, William Henry Gist received something in the mail. Excuse me. He received this. Well, this is a replica of what he received. This is a replica of a John Brown pike. Now a pike is a medieval weapon meant to stab from a distance. Be a pretty good weapon to give enslaved individuals in a slave uprising, as many enslaved people never had the opportunity to fire, even handle a gun. This is a pretty self-explanatory weapon. You just pick it up and you stab, and you don't need to reload it. In preparation for the slave uprising before the raid of the federal armory, John Brown acquired nearly 1,000 pikes of this. He hid them in a barn in Pike, where they waited for the slave uprising and never happened. After the failed raid of the armory, the pikes were defeated, and that the institution of slavery was still strong in the South. He took the pike to the State House in Columbia, and he showed it to the South Carolina legislatures. And he left the pike there so any South Carolinian could come see the symbol of John Brown's defeat. Unfortunately, we don't know what happened to the original pike. At some point when it was in the State House, it disappeared. We haven't been able to track it. But based on John Brown's specifications, the pike gets received would have looked a lot like that replica. But feel free to look around here. There's a lot in this room, so I know you guys have questions, so let me know.
One out through here.
We don't know what these two back rooms on the first floor were used for. We have set this up as kind of like a ladies' parlor. This room may have been used by his second wife, Mary Elizabeth. And in 1860, we know, based on the 1860 census, that there were 5 enslaved seamstresses. These women may have been in here with Mary Elizabeth, and many times doing things like darning socks, making clothing for not just the Gist family, but potentially all the 178 people who were enslaved here. So this room may have been occupied a lot. All the artwork you do see in here was made by Mary Elizabeth at different points in her life. Much of it is needlework. Back then, elite white women, when they were girls and teenagers before they got married, they were expected to learn certain skills that were very of the feminine nature: embroidery, painting, foreign languages, generally the Romance languages, playing certain instruments, the piano and the harp were appropriate. All of these skills were meant to entice and attract a suitable husband. It was their job to learn them. So rather than continuing their education with their brothers at a certain age, they learned these things. But take your time. Now we're going to head across the way and see some primary sources that we do have for this plantation. This room. So, as far as primary sources, we do not have William Henry Gist papers or a plantation journal. All people like this, all people who are planters kept plantation journals. It was just basic accounting. But when you look at those kind of journals, it gives you a wealth of information about the plantation, potentially about the enslaved people here. But any journal Gist kept or papers are just missing. But we do have access to certain primary sources that we use for interpretation, like the 1860 census, which I've mentioned a lot. This is the slave schedule. In the census of 1850 and 1860, they separated and listed enslaved people in a separate section called the slave schedule. In 1860, that was the year that Gist reported owning 178 enslaved people. You'll notice on this blown up copy of the census, of those 178 people, not one person is listed with a name. All they're listed with is an age, a gender, and a color. And a few individuals have a skill set listed next to those identifiers. They were not listed on the census to identify them. Unfortunately, this is very common on slave schedules. They were listed for taxation purposes and representation in the government, as an enslaved person was considered under the law 3/5 of a person. table some original labor contracts, well, copies of original labor contracts between Gist and freed men and women. These are from 1866 to 1868, so just following emancipation. You are welcome to pick them up and read through them.
Read them. They won't do me no good. I can't read. I'm sorry.
That's okay. And then here we have a blown up copy of part of William Henry Gist's father Francis's estate. This portion does you as they would any other property, and they just put the value that they would work on there. It just shows how little people like Gist and his father saw enslaved individuals. They used them to make them wealthy, but they saw them, or at least wanted to see them, as less than human. Here we do have a picture of Clyde Franks, who did the restoration on the house in the 1940s and 1950s. And next to Clyde Franks is the house in the late 1930s when the U.S. Forest Service acquired it. Now remember, the Gist family was having renters in this house pretty much until the point they sold the property to the Forest Service. So that does finish our tour. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you have any questions, but I'll let you guys out right over here. Thank you. You're welcome.
That's it. Thanks for watching. Lost Richard's blog. Shane Lawson. I got inside the house. I'll have to put it in 2 sections for this video. I'll see you later. Bye. Lost Richard's blog. Shane Lawson. Thank you for watching. See ya. Bye. Get a little bit right quick. There's the souvenirs. Trying to hurry up on back to kick the bucket. Now I gotta charge it. Books and all that. Shirts. Notes out there. See y'all later.